Sí, porque
A veces le pide a sus papás que lo lleven.
No se quieren venir acá para que no estén tan alejados.
ven como a mí.
Doctora Rosenthal, por favor. Lidia, ¿no te quieres venir aquí? Te dejo mi lugar. Feliz de la vida. ¿Ready? Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Por cortesía con nuestro invitado I will switch to English. It is a great honor for me to have you not only in Mexico, but in the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations. And as you probably everybody around this table knows of you, and have read many of your books. So Agustin will make a further introduction, but I just want to say that it's a real pleasure to have you here and to listen to, talk about your latest book, the Mexican Heartland. It is a complete change of narrative from what we've been hearing lately. So it will be a pleasure to hear you talk about how Mexico is the center of global capitalism.
A center.
Exactly.
Important
I
enough.
was being too ambitious. So welcome to Mexico. And before I pass the floor to Agustin, I just want to thank Raimundo Enriquez, a partner of Baker McKinsey, for his incredible hospitality. Really, thank you.
I think we should make this the headquarters of Comexi.
That's what I told her. You're at home.
That's pretty nice.
Thank you.
Really, it's more than a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much. And with that, I'll pass you the floor.
Just before we begin, if Amy Glover could give a welcome on behalf of Georgetown, I think that would be a good idea, and then I'll give the intro and we can go right into it.
Sure.
At the same time, tell us a little bit about NAFTA.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know anything about it. I graduated from Georgetown University in 1991, a long time ago, and I studied American government, actually. And I graduated same year as my husband, Ken Smith, who studied in SFS. Agustin.
Many years before.
And Georgetown has a long history of interest in Latin America and in Mexico in particular. And there's a movement afoot to really see if Georgetown can even develop a chair eventually for related to Mexico bilateral issues. So that's something, actually in October, there's going to be, I think it's the weekend of Columbus Day, long weekend. There's going to be
October, they signed the conversation.
Yeah,
for the
kind of an alumni weekend here in Mexico City. So I think it's a great opportunity to kind of highlight the importance of the ties between Georgetown University and Mexico.
That's a world alumni, that is not Mexico.
Yeah. So we're looking forward to that and making a big splash. So anyone
And you are coming to that event,
And
I was told.
Matthew Collins asked me to come. Not only would I be happy to come, but it turned out the historiadores de México del Mundo are going to meet in Guadalajara at the end of that week. So I can just do it as an excursion. I can come here for Georgetown alone, and then I can join the historians of Mexico from everywhere in Guadalajara. So I'm more than pleased.
Excellent. So this is a great way to kick off a year of Georgetown University Fellow events here in Mexico City, and welcome to everyone. I've been a member of COMEXI for many, many years now, so it's great to be able to combine the two efforts. And thanks again to Baker McKinsey for the lovely hospitality here.
No, absolutely. Thank you very much, Professor, for coming to Mexico on our behalf in many ways. I know you have another speech at COMEX.
We're doing, shall we say, the more academic presentation on Wednesday afternoon at COMEX.
I'm glad they were able to take advantage of your visit as well. Raimundo, thank you very, very much. Mariana, congratulations once again for putting this together. The narrative defines everything, right? stories that we tell each other basically define who we are and how we respond. And I think one of the ways that we've been remiss, both as a region and particularly as a country, is to be ignorant of of what Mexico has meant to North America. Everything that is going on, everything that is going wrong in the United States, in many ways, can be tied to this debate about the fact that we haven't wrapped our heads around what Mexico does in North America. What is it for? Who are these people? What are they doing, right? And so whether it's shutting down the government because of DACA or actually winning the White House based on anti-Mexican bias, you're seeing this once and again, and it's coming back to haunt us, and not knowing our history, and not knowing our role in North America, not knowing our role in the world, not knowing things as basic as the fact that the dollar sign is in fact the Mexican peso sign, and that's how far back we go, if not further. All of that is coming back to roost, and it's coming back to hurt all of us. And now it's become not just a quaint thing, but a national security imperative that we actually figure this out. And we got to do it quickly, because it is certainly on a railroad track down to disaster. And so, thanks to Professor Tutino, we now have a very scholarly work, as it says in one of the blurbs with respect to the book, a scholarly work with respect to Mexico's important role in the first wave of globalization. And with that, I give him a warm welcome on behalf of our group. I'd also like to give a welcome to Jorge Ortega, a Georgetown alum who historically has been very active within our Georgetown community. I'm glad to see him back, and I hope to see him redouble his efforts on behalf of the Georgetown community, and of course the presence of several ambassadors, as you've noticed. A lot of our top people are here, and I'm very, very glad that we were able to pull that out.
Another Georgetown alum that you didn't mention.
And of course my favorite friends.
And the one Georgetown alum I had the
Who
great
actually-
pleasure to teach more than once. So I say, I got to poison her mind. I'm sure she'd surmount it.
It has been.
Exactly. So John, if you'd like to go ahead
Sure.
and talk to us about that.
And we talked about this, that I want to do a relatively brief opening. I've talked about it 15, 20 minutes, try to outline the trajectory that this book argues that I think will be a surprise to many of you. But I'm not going to try to explain the basics, the transitions, et cetera, et cetera. I want to leave that to your questions, to your give and take. So to a degree, what I'm going to do, I'm sort of going to warn you, this is going to be a rapid flight over 500 years of rethinking Mexican history. First at the macro level in the world, and then where do Mexican communities fit into that in changing ways over this long world? So, and the other thing I say to people came up Saturday morning, well, how long have you been working on this book? Well, I've been trying to figure out life in rural communities in central Mexico since the early 1970s. That has been the focus of what I've been trying to do. I took a detour to the Bajío recently, but really I've been working on this region longer and more intensely. And it was in the detour to the Bajío that I figured out, 2005, 6, 7, that the Bajío and its silver were incredibly important to the origins of the global economy in the early modern period. And I wrote a book called Making a New World. It's now out in Spanish with Fondo called Creando un Nuevo Mundo, on how the Bajío and its silver were an engine of early modern globalization. To give you the minimal piece of that, we had an era of commercial capitalism before the Industrial Revolution, and it was global. And what has not been recognized is that the key commerce was getting silks, porcelains out of China, and elegant cotton goods out of India. They were the dominant industries and exports in the world for 3 centuries, from the 60s to the 80s. And they would, well, to put it simply, Europeans and others wanted them. And Europe made nothing any Asian society wanted. And both China and Asia said, you may trade with us if you pay in silver. And that is, and Europe's silver came early from Potosi and New Spain. But in the 18th century, New Spain is the global money supply. I mean, that in the end is the answer to why New Spain's peso funded the US war for independence. They just adopted the dollar sign. They adopted the peso. Dollar is a synonym for the peso. You know, you've heard these tales, some countries should adopt the US dollar. You never hear them say, just like we adopted the peso, when the peso was the dominant currency in the world. And it's not a Spanish peso. It is New Spain's peso. And it's coming from here to the US. And for 3 centuries, New Spain is one of the pivotal engines of global trade, global commercial capitalism. You could probably sit and find 5 or 6 other places in the world that were of parallel importance in this early modern economy. All right, so stage 1, New Spain is one of the fundamentally most important places in the world economy. And by the way, what was the role of what's now the United States before 1800 in the world economy? Fish, tobacco. I mean, it is a backward place. I can say that. I know you're not supposed to. But being a estadounidense, it was simply a backward place at that time. All right, this I have to run by. What I know was a decade of revolution, though you've all been taught was the war for independence. Insurgents in the Bajío and elsewhere took down silver capitalism. They cut the world's money supply in half. Think about what we would do today if the world's money supply fell by half in a year and a half. It's part of a wider transformation, but it's an active part of the shift toward the Industrial Revolution. What did the Industrial Revolution create? Machine-made cotton cloth. England transformed the world with machine-made cotton. We've all been taught that. Nobody asked, what, did nobody make cotton before? Did nobody in the world make or buy cotton? The people of India sold the world's cotton, and it was all bought with Mexican pesos. And part of the facilitation for the origins of the British Industrial Revolution was that the end of money supply in Mexican pesos was an enormous shock to India's ability to sell cotton cloth. And these British tinkerers who were just beginning to mechanize. And in fact, if you look at it, Britain sold more Indian textiles than machine-made textiles in 1810. Very interesting thing. By 1816, 17, the machine-made textiles had taken over the world market. And the Indian textiles have crashed because the whole economy debate has crashed. So New Spain's transformation between 1810 and 1820 is far more than a war for independence. It is one of the key conflicts in the transformation from global commercial capitalism to global industrial capitalism. But the day New Spain becomes Mexico, it is an independent society after a decade racked by conflict, political and social, and its economy, which was, I call it silver capitalism, gone. The economy that had sustained New Spain has just been taken down. So the day you start, and everybody studies the search for a government in Mexico, nobody studies the search for an economy in Mexico, which was simultaneous and equally necessary. And one of the things the book traces is, and it was not unsuccessful. We forget, oh yes, the great British Industrial Revolution of say 1780, 1820. The US, the 18 teens. The next major mechanized industrialization, Mexico beginning in the late 1830s. And it grew through the entire 19th century. And Mexico had the second largest mechanized textile industry in the Western Hemisphere for the entire 19th century. Yet somehow that is erased, right? It actually had a reasonably successful transformation to mechanized industrialization. It took until the 40s till the silver even began to revive. And there are lots of other complications. But one can argue that Mexico struggled to find an economy in the world of industrial capitalism in the 19th century. But in fact, from the Diaz era on, the textile industry is still booming. It finds export industries for the first time. Cotton, coffee, variety of other things. Later copper, later petroleum, before the revolution. Monterey, we forget it had an iron and steel industry in the 19th century. And a beer industry. And they made the glass bottles, and they made the carton. Mexico was actually, after the United States, the most successful participant in what could be called industrial capitalism in the Western Hemisphere. We've erased that because we asked, well, how could that be if the revolution happened? Well, the revolution happened out of some disjunctions, mostly in certain regions, from some political breakdowns. Always nice to avoid political breakdowns if you're having other problems. But the second point I want to make quickly in this overview is, everybody talks about the Mexican Revolution, what it did or didn't do. People say, well, was it constructive or destructive? And I say it was both. And if you can't deal with the fact that it's devastatingly destructive and radically creative at the same time, you can't deal with what it was. But what we forget is, if the decade of violence from 1810 to 1820 was pivotal to the taking down of first wave commercial capitalism and making way for industrial capitalism, we forget that the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920, not quite so pivotal, but important at a second level to the rattling of industrial capitalism. That the latest studies in global economic history emphasize that 19th century industrial capitalism was first shaken in that decade. And that's what World War I was the hegemons of industrial capitalism pounding each other to death in Europe at the same time that Mexico and Russia in the same decade had revolutions. 19th century industrial capitalism would never recover in the same way. It held on, and of course everybody knows it fell into depression. Right. But again, Mexico is a major player in that transition. Not always being central as in the most creative, but Mexico's attempt at industrial capitalism has come to deep contradictions. Some real flourishing and some real social problems. You have a revolutionary conflict that addresses it, and it rattles the system. And it rattled the system, and sometimes it's nice to remember, of all of the three things I mentioned, which came first. The Mexican Revolution is going before World War I is going, before the Russian Revolution is going. Arguably, it is the opening of the rattling. Though, again, I'm not arguing it's the, right? If World War I had not come, one thing, Mexican Revolution would have been different. It was easier to have a revolution while the U.S. was worrying about those goals. But the sequence happened, right? So after the revolution, we all have all kinds of perspectives, but what it suddenly dawned on me that in the aftermath of the revolution, it's not quite in 1920, but starting in the mid to late 1930s, Mexico is one of, if not the pioneers at the experiment in national capitalism, at imagining that capitalism doesn't need to be a global system, which it had always been. In the early one, it was a global trade system. Industrial capitalism, what centers of industry, Britain, northeastern US, everybody else is a peripheral buyer supplier. It's a unique challenge to say we can all do it. We can bring industry home. And Mexico tried. And what I argue in the book is, for a variety of reasons, the devastation of the post-revolutionary era, the Depression, World War II, and the immediate aftermath, credits from the war. The Mexican experiment, I go this far, it was possible. Right? The chance of having a viable national capitalism was imaginably possible, and it had some successes. If you find most of the gains were in that period through the 40s and the 50s. I'm not saying it had without problems, etc. And it's after World War II, when the credits run out, when the US turns its attention to rebuilding what I call the Northern Hemisphere axis of integrated global capitalism that tells Latin America, you're on your own and get your capital from the banks. And from about 1950, it's a relative date, the potential for doing the national capitalist project is just running against the grain of the global capitalist project. And that hit something else. At that point, the global population explodes. And whatever Mexico could have done as it grew from, 14 to 16 million people, from the 20s to the 50s. Think of the pressures of growing from 25 million to 100 million. 5 times more population. And we act like quintupling the number of humans you're trying to deal with is just a ho-hum. Well, we'll get the policy right. There are questions of resources laid everything out. It is an enormous stress. It is an enormous challenge. And one of the things the book argues is, from that point on, because it was one of the pioneers and one of the more successful experimenters in natural capitalism, it keeps at it. But it keeps coming to crisis after crisis after crisis. I don't have to tell you folks the sequence of the collapse of the model till the 80s, the 90s, et cetera. So that's sort of the argument of the book. Mexico in the sequence of global commercial capitalism, 19th century industrial capitalism, the experiment in national capitalism, and at the very end, the transition to globalization via NAFTA as a whole. And for Mexico, the commercial, industrial, national seem like the 3 stages. As the national capitalist experiment falls into the past, I actually think it wasn't a stage, it was a transition. And that it was commercial capitalism, it was industrial capitalism, it was globalizing capitalism. And Mexico was also part of the great transition. Both transitions were more national than global. The War for Independence attempts to do a national unit in the global system. The revolution and post-revolution, trying to do something national in a world that insistently is becoming globalized in so many ways. So that's the macro model. Now I'm going to really briefly, and that's, I think, 5 of the chapters do that model. But then the core of the book is people in the communities surrounding here. So many not so far from here. This area, by the way, was rural for a long time. How they lived under this. And that's the other surprise, which is in the era of global silver capitalism. 2 things. There is no viable conclusion other than that the rural communities around Mexico City, and I came to this verb, they carried it. They produced the food, they provided the labor, they were pivotal to carrying it. And not only that, because they were organized in these units that Spanish Crown actively called indigenous republics. Certainly in the United States, we've erased the word because, of course, no way could the Spaniards have brought republics to indigenous peoples. That couldn't be. But that is what they were. That's what they're called. They had their own land. They were self-governing with local councils. But the other factor here is, and again, the contradictions of history, the enormous disease-driven depopulation. The population of this region fell by 90% between contact and 1500. That still left hundreds of thousands. But they are hundreds of thousands of survivors with more than enough land to be independent. And yet suddenly Spain has the opportunity for macro profit with silver. And it's in that context that they literally organized the communities, gave them rights, take care of yourselves, but please send food to the city and send your sons to the mines. Because we've got to do the work. And it's the people at the bottom are not as prosperous as the people at the top. I've been studying history long enough that I'm not going to find a society of utopian egalitarianism at the top. But the people at the base in that period had viable lives for the time, and they survived. One of the best examples of that is during the Wars for Independence, when the Bahia, without indigenous republic, the locals took arms and took everything down. with the exception of the Mestital, which is its own region, and we'll leave it aside for the moment, the communities of the heartland stayed home, stayed at work, formed militias in defense of the crown, because they appreciated the crown giving them indigenous republics and land. They did not fight to take the system down. They carried on to let it live. But when silver collapsed, everything collapsed. So, but indigenous communities in the heartland were absolutely pivotal to carrying global capitalism for 3 centuries. What happens afterwards? Well, ironically, when everything collapses, there's amazing evidence for the first 2 or 3 decades after independence. The economy's a mess, the government's a mess, and the communities got to play. I've been able to document wages went up 50%, they got more land, they actually gained. There's a, I think Sandra knows or remembers my colleague, Eric Blanker. And we have this thing, the only people who really won independence in the early 19th century were the indigenous peoples who played while the states were falling apart. And they actually did well for a time. But then Mexican liberals had a wonderful solution. They concluded that the communities that had carried capitalism for 3 centuries were now inhibiting it. And they legislated to deny them self-government and to deny them land and to force it into the market. And they legislated it beginning right after independence, but the famous one is Juarez, but nobody could enforce it. The communities are so entrenched. They could not enforce it until after 1870. But then it gets enforced. And so you start privatizing community land. And in a famous quote from Miguel Lera de Tejada, who legislated this for Juarez and implemented it, he said, the purpose of this is to mobilize the land. And every good liberal knows that mobile property is a good thing. But if indigenous peoples have a monopoly on their land and you mobilize it, which direction is it going to flow? It can only flow away. It's not going to flow toward them. If it's in the market and resources have access, it will not flow toward the communities. It will flow away. It's not an expropriation. Revolutionary rhetoric, the Hacendados took it all. It was a wonderful tactic, but it's not what happened. Once they did this, the lands just concentrated, not surprisingly. People with resources in the community bought more, population grows, and so you have this period of concentration of land and a spread of landlessness. And that is the lead up to Zapata for there. And the classic attempt to get more land back, but as I've jokingly said in the past, they fought for tierra y libertad, and they got tierra y el Estado. And that's not quite the same thing in that. So, but they do get the land back. And ironically, the 1920s, as right after independence, there are 2 or 3 decades where the communities are better off. It's pretty clear that the survivors of the revolution, and not everybody survived, got enough land in the early post-revolution that they were better off. They produced more, they fed their kids, and of course what happens when you feed kids more? They live, they grow up. You have more house to feed, and the land you've got is no longer enough because you have more kids. They have a moment. But boy, again, the population explosion, the resources were given to be just enough at the low rural population of the 1920s and 30s. Put that in the context of the post-1940 and 50 population explosion. And again, it's a contradiction. Yes, the global pharmaceutical industries bring penicillin, etc. Who doesn't want their kids to be healthy and grow up? This is not some nasty conspiracy. But kids that used to die at 50% rates are now growing up at 80% rates, and you fuel this population explosion. So the land that had been is no longer enough, in part just in Mexico, right, under the population. And starting with Cardenas, why do you use so much land reform? It's not so often recognized. What Cardenas worried about is that the land reform recipients weren't feeding the cities. They were keeping the food home and not feeding the cities, and this inhibits his industrial project, right? So here, and it's post-Cardenas, etc., the vaunted Green Revolution. And the pharmaceutical industry enables people to live and drives this huge population explosion. the Green Revolution, as adapted in Mexico, creates the ability to produce the food to keep those people alive. And it is clearly true. It produced enough food to keep the people alive. And then the question is, so what's the problem? Because it was a mechanized, chemicalized, it produced the food while employing no one, while expelling humanity from the countryside. And how do you get access to food in any capitalist society you and I know? You have to buy it. You have to have work. And so you create a population explosion. You create an amazing system of feeding that population. But it's based on a system that is eliminating paid work or self-sufficiency, either way, in rural Mexico. And I will close with this. It's brutal, but it illustrates certain things. So, in the face of all of this, between about 1950 and 2000, Mexico City grew from 2 million to 20 million. The Mexican population of the United States grew to exceed 20 million from much smaller numbers. And those are the two flows. That is where the people who couldn't live in the countryside, and half of them came, and it's not just Mexico City, this is a big example, but they came, they fell, they didn't have resources, and those of you who are old enough like me remember many of you just built their houses and neighborhoods with their own hands. What else do you do when you get to the city and don't have a job? You build it yourself. And others went al norte. And what did they do? They worked when they could. They built shacks on the outside of villages with their own hands. So it's an enormous disjunction of creativity and problems. I quickly argue, nobody at any one of these stages planned anything. This is not a policy creation, but it's at the intersection of demographics, economics, yes, politics too, and ways to do things. And we have gotten today, and the book kind of ends with, some people have noted, a rather dark and foreboding set of concerns in which there is this ability to produce so much in the world, and here too. But with all of what we produce, we are also producing marginal excluded communities that aren't going away. They're just sort of spreading out. And that's where this ends. What next? And I have no answers for you. One of the reasons I'm happy to talk to all of you, you're all better placed to find an answer than I am. But so it tries to do those two trajectories, the Mexico and the world, and how Mexican communities have lived. And I'm happy to shift to
No, absolutely.
questions.
And I think just very briefly, because there is a lot of things that haven't been picked up generally. I think the demographic story is a huge hole in our history. I was staggered recently to find, and this wasn't because of our conversation, the fact that Mexico's population went from being 20 million to 1.5 million after contact.
That's a minor.
It's unbelievable.
The radicals go 25 million to 800,000 to 1 million in the Mesoamerican regions of Mexico, not counting the Chichimecas, who were uncountable.
Such that you had, and it was such a quick, and it wasn't just European diseases, it wasn't just smallpox in that. There's also something called coprolizi, which was a local hemorrhagic fever that people still haven't quite figured out, and the massive deaths that took place. And then what you mentioned with respect to the population explosion, at the end of the revolution, we had around 20 million people. Today we have 162 million.
There are more people in Mexico City today than there were in the country at the revolution.
By far, and in greater Mexico City. So 162, by the way, I'm adding 127 in the Republic, plus 35 in the United States, Mexicans and Mexican Americans. It's staggering because the numbers for the United States are around 100 to 300 million, only 3 times, not, 8 times? I mean, it's really amazing when you get down into this information.
And then you have to add everybody that went to the United States.
No.
He's
That's
asking that those in
127
his
plus
number.
35 is the 162.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned on the TV program that I think might be worth just briefly noting before we open up the floor to questions is China, because you tied together the fall of China to the situation,
Yes.
to the Mexican independence.
And it's part of what makes clear both Mexico's role and its fall in ways people don't understand. But there is always some debate over causes at every state, but I figured out recently that to understand Mexican or all of Latin American history, you have to see the U-shaped demographic curve. That in the 16th century, population plummeted by 90% across the Americas, leveled off, and then it slowly and unsteadily grew, right? And it has this slow, steady growth till about 19. And the bottom is 1600, 1650, grows to 1950, and then it shoots up. And it doesn't actually cause anything in particular, but it's the ultimate background reality, the number of humans. Because, right, the Mexican environment, its resources are more or less set. So that's sitting there. The China story is one that, to me, I hope makes this sort of whole role of Mexico in the world clear, but also has an interesting little, I will say, metaphoric tale for the United States. So the key point in the origins of the silver, one day in 1551, the Emperor in Ming China, the largest political unit, demographic unit, economic unit, manufacturing in the sense of making by hand unit on Earth, said, you know, this bimetallic world of gold and silver is a pain in the ass. It would be so much easier for me if we only used silver. And he decreed that for the entire Chinese empire, all internal taxation, large internal trade, and all external trade would be done only in silver. This is 1551. He had not a clue that somebody had found silver in Potosi or Zacatecas, etc. I call it the great coincidence. He thought he would get his silver from Japan, which he was lucky because it actually ran out in Japan 2 or 3 decades after this. But that sets up this relationship where Mexico is the money supply for the Chinese empire for 2.5 centuries. And it generates global trade at that level. And China is. And Chinese silks, Chinese porcelains. I can remember even in graduate school saying, why the hell did the Spanish take Manila? Duh. Manila was a city of Chinese merchants, not a Spanish city. And Chinese merchants gathered all the goods of Asia there, not only from China, but from India and the islands, and traded them back. And I have found, for example, moderately well-to-do families in Celaya in the 1670s, who the wardrobe is full of Chinese goods. And these folks are buying, etc. And the basic tale is all the silver went to China. Some went east around the world and got to China. The rest went west directly to China. But it drives the whole global circuit of trade. I didn't do that research, by the way. A couple of economists named Dennis Flynn and Arturo Giraldes did a bunch of articles in the 90s and early 2000s. And my wonderful colleague, John McNeil, kept saying to me, you got to read Flynn and Giraldes. And one day I listened and read it, and it sort of, I understood, I'd like to say. So you have this relationship. And then between September of 1810, when Hidalgo's folks, and we think of Hidalgo, but we forget, he rose for political reasons, aiming to change a political reality. And at best, he thought he could mobilize 1,500 folks. Unbeknownst to him or anyone else, within 2 weeks, he had 40,000 Bajío rural people, unhappy, machetes in arm. They didn't care who was in power. They did 2 things. First, they emptied the granaries to feed their kids. And second, they took control of the land so that the next harvest would be theirs, not the Hacienda. It becomes a 10-year guerrilla war of the pueblos against the army. Calleja, Iturbide, a couple of well-known names. Our wonderful founding father, Iturbide. I don't know how many of you know his nickname before he became emperor. The Butcher of the Bajío. He was so famous for putting down these popular insurgents in the Bajío. We all have contradictory characteristics. But the war, the war, you couldn't invest in the mines. It absorbed everything. So the mines just, and a mine 600 yards underground, if it is not drained and reinforced in 3 weeks, is a wonderfully deep well. And given the technology of the time, once it's a well, it's a well. And so the total silver output in the Bajío collapsed by about 70%. Zacatecas wasn't hit so hard. The total silver output in Spain fell by half between September of 1810 and the end of 1811. It never rose, it stayed at that half level till 1840. And when I say Mexico lost its economy, that was over. And it completely destroyed, and again, this is, one of the lessons of this is just read people who write about other parts of the world. And I have wonderful colleagues. I was actually at a doctoral comprehensive exam. A couple of my colleagues said, oh, have you heard about Man Wanling's China Upside Down? What's that? A wonderful Chinese woman, economic historian, wrote a book on how the loss of silver from the New World undermined the Chinese economy between 1810 and 1860. And she only attributed it to the wars for independence in Latin America, because that's all she could think of. But it is the insurgency in the Bajío that does it. And she documents how the lack of silver completely undermined China as an industrial producer. When it started to export again, it exported raw silk, not manufactured silk. Very few porcelains. And it became the world's great exporter of silver because it had been accumulating silver, but it no longer had the economy to maintain it. So it has stores of silver. And this is going to hit a tale some of you will know a little bit. They started to export silver. Does anybody know where that silver went when China becomes an exporter? What? No, not then. Via British merchants. So the Europeans got their cut. They exported it to India, but now India is no longer exporting cottons. They are importing opium. And so China becomes an exporter of silver via British merchants to buy opium. And as I conclude the sad tale when I tell this in the United States, the first major post-hegemonic power faced the first major societal drug crisis in opium. And China lived with the pummeling of opium for the 19th century. That part's kind of famous. But the linkage to this transformation is not so well known.
John, when was Mexican coinage legal tender in China?
I believe, somebody the other day, immediately, because it's silver by weight. And why it's legal is because the Casa de Moneda was really good. It made coins, and they stood by those coins. And ironically, we now know, thanks to Picasso Gutierrez, a wonderful Mexican historian, they actually mechanized the mint in the 1730s and 40s. They had one of the first mechanized mints here. But it is a trusted coin, is what we will say. And so it's not legal tender alone, meaning the Chinese will take silver, but it is the silver that they trust the most. And certainly it's coming and going, but by the early 17th century, the relationship via Manila is fully established, right? The other people there, the Flynn and Heraldez, after documenting the importance of silver, wrote a second piece in which they dated the origins of globalization in its longest from the early 1570s when the first expedition left Acapulco and made it to Manila and came back and made global trade constantly global in all directions.
Carlos Fuentes has a very interesting essay on the beginning of globalization.
Yeah.
Linked to exactly that.
Yeah.
And there's that idea that the word yuan is a descriptive term for round coin, and such that the round coin that they were describing was actually the Mexican peso.
Yeah. Highly probable.
So not only the dollar, but the yuan, both named by.
And the dollar. For a historian like me, who much of my hard personal research has been between about 1780 and 1848, and during those dates, the Mexican peso, New Spain and then Mexican peso, and the dollar are identical. They're one-to-one. You don't have to do a transition. So I know what George Washington was worth in Mexican terms and vice versa. And gee, what a surprise the date 1848 when the currencies divided in their trajectories and value. Can't imagine what happened that day. That might have set the countries on no longer parallel, integrated.
So I think that the idea would be to have a few questions, if
Yes.
that's okay. When do you want to finish? It's 8 o'clock. Should we try for 8:30? Does that sound good? So, any questions?
Yeah,
I have a question.
I'm used to Sandra's questions.
I love listening to this very broad narrative that you gave us today, and I haven't read the book yet, but I will. I'm curious about one thing that I found in my own research, which is about how the ejido legislation takes on population growth in the 40s and 50s with the Reforma Agraria actually being implemented. And I'm always stunned that they were not accounting for population growth. So there's a number of ejidatarios and they get the land, but
There's no expansion.
there is no expansion, and that's what makes a lot of these communities be
Yes.
in really dire straits, because there's
Right.
absolutely no way to grow. So
And there are so many ways to answer that, because the ejido legislation is so revealing. It's advertised as, oh, we're responding to the agrarian demand. Sure it is, in a general way. First of all, the ejido legislation only gives first grants to men, whereas the Hispanic land law allowed divided use. It was not male only. So it actually reconsolidated patriarchy in rural communities, right? Now, afterwards, if there were no male heirs, a wife or a daughter, but only if there were no male heirs. Quite different from Spanish law, which was much more bilateral historically. That's the first thing. The second thing is, whatever anybody said, it was a pacification program. We want to give you just enough land to tell you to stay home, put down your machetes, feed yourself, and leave us alone to run the government. Right? In that context, we give you just enough land to feed your family today. Makes sense.
What comes tomorrow?
You have to, well, you're also expropriating powerful people. And many people being expropriated are powerful people. I mean, again, it's a reasonably sane political act. We will take no more from our powerful friends to pacify these folks we don't really like so much. But if we can get them to go home and leave the machetes aside, we can do the Mexico we want. In that context, it seems to me, that's what they were going to do. Cárdenas did start giving more land,
there were expansions,
but not huge. In part because
nothing that accounted
he
for.
dreamed that if he gave more land per family, they would have a surplus. He wanted the ejido to feed the city. But of course, they just ate better. He was really frustrated that he would give them more land, and instead of selling cheap food to Mexico City, they would eat better at home. And of course, the ejidatarios said, why shouldn't we feed our children first? Is that somehow wrong? And thus, he, at the end of his term, right, starts negotiating with the Rockefeller Foundation, the Henry Wallace Pioneer Seeds, to do the Green Revolution here, to do a completely different way. But yeah, there's no accounting for population growth.
What's it, to
Even at the old level, and other than they can't imagine the population explosion.
But even just in terms of who.
You won't. I'm
he
sorry.
doesn't care.
Right.
But as a historian, when
Yeah.
when you analyze Mexico and the history, and in your presentation, Mexico has had throughout the years a lot of things going very well for Mexico, from
Mhm.
having a reserve currency, having the first university. We were immersed in a global economy, commercial economy, etc. However, when we lost that economy, as you said, there were a lot of other examples in the world that
Mhm.
managed to pull it together. In your view, and as an expert of Mexico, what didn't we do?
Okay. I actually, and this isn't something I came to, I came to Mexican history idealizing Juarez, the liberals, right? This is how you first learn it everywhere. And it took me a long time to figure out that given Mexico having roots in capitalism, a society that knew how to live within capitalism, rural communities had adapted to be a mix of self-sufficiency, but also address the needs of capitalism, right? My conclusion, the Mexican community had sustained capitalism by the mid-19th century for 4 centuries, right? Long time. the liberals' decision to destroy the social institution, that it carried the system and that had sustained lives in the communities. And it was ideological. They believed that individualism was better than communitarianism. My view is, why does it have to be the same way? Why can't you have an individual economy at the top? And if these communities that sustain you want some communitarian issues and they will sustain you and keep the peace, gee, that could be useful. But that is also new. Under Spanish rule, there actually were different laws for different groups. That was no problem. Modern liberalism wants one law. You can't have multiple laws for multiple people. We just think that's an inevitable truth. And I look at 19th century liberals, and they did two things that I do not think helped Mexico. One is destroying the rural community. And they did as policy conscious. They thought it was bad. And secondly, what is the one cultural reality institution that 98% of all Mexicans committed to in the 19th century? Church. And what else did the liberals decide had to be taken down? They created political conflict by attacking the church. And the church didn't have a lot of property. The property was gone with the expropriation of the Jesuits. It was gone with Spanish expropriations during the war, before the Wars for Independence, to fund the Napoleonic Wars. The church had a little bit of capital, but it wasn't that rich. They took on the church. They took on the two close to universal things. Actually, it's amazing how they actually held power doing that. What an amazing feat, it seems to me. But I would argue that that is where they destabilized certain possibilities. But on the large, that can't be undone. We can't undo the liberal 19th century. Where I see optimism, I don't know how to get there, but the model, the fact that communities have the ability to organize in their own interests and deal with the local landlord, the local government, even the state government, and they could come together as a community, find out what their need was, and represent themselves as a community. They had that legal right for the entire Spanish period. And they kept it de facto through the first half of the 19th century because nobody could stop them at that point, right? And dare I say politely, and the shift to globalization and NAFTA, the two institutions that gave working communities a chance to organize and express themselves were determined as inhibiting of globalization. And we took down labor unions, and we took down ejidos, the last remnant of this. And I know all the tale of the problems, the limits, what couldn't do. The old communities weren't perfect. Yeah, the community leaders could be exploitative, but they could turn around and serve the community. Just like labor bosses could be damned exploitative within, but at key points. I'll speak for my society. Reagan convinced the United States they'd be better off without unions. And we have watched the average income of Americans plummet ever since. I don't know how to redo it, and it won't be unions in the traditional sense. And it won't be rural communities. That's a historic loss. But my sense is, we're not going to legislate this universally at the top and make everything better. But if we can be open to ways that people just trying to build everyday lives can be sanctioned to figure out what their interests are and represent themselves. Kind of, I don't know if you followed what the school teachers of West Virginia are doing the last week. The most right-wing, right, et cetera. Every school teacher in Virginia walked out in West Virginia, and they have forced the state government of West Virginia to, and they were the worst paid teachers in the country. And they have found a way to express themselves. It's not a legal strike, but every kid, and now every family is a two-career family. The parents need the kids at school to watch the kids, and every kid in West Virginia is home. This is amazingly effective, shall we say, tactic. So effective that the red state of Oklahoma is now about to follow the teachers in Oklahoma. And I'm not saying that one or the other, but we have to find ways, it seems to me, for people to be able to organize locally. You know, I think we all know the limits of macro elections in the era of money and media. They do not lead to radical transforming solutions for the low. And I can speak for my lovely political system on that. So anyway, that's my generic thought. We need to let people organize to seek what works for them in whatever unit works for them. And I don't know what that is.
But at the same time, they have to immerse themselves in the global one.
Yes, exactly. But there have been these imagined things. So what would happen? And this has been fought against endlessly. What if there were a united, now that so much of the auto industry is transnational across the border, and it's built on the fact that Mexico does assembly with lower wages, let's be straightforward, and that US does design and other things with higher wages, you're probably never going to equalize them. But what if you could organize a transnational UAW in which they could coordinate their needs and say, okay, we're not going to reshift this, but everybody might be a little better off. And in fact, of course, the auto workers are far from the worst off here. The real problem I see is, one of the things that the book ends on, if you want a sense of the places, the Chalco Plain I have studied since forever. Yeah. And it was Mexico City's granary. It fed this city for centuries, from Aztec times till the middle of the 20th century. Now, it is completely covered with middling to shack residents, mostly. And the people there eat by going to Walmart or its subsidiaries, buying things produced anywhere but Chalco, right? And it is sort of a circuit that keeps them alive. Yeah, how do you organize in this? That's why I said, I sort of have this sense, if people could find a means to speak for themselves, and then I guess I can't figure out what it is, but the West Virginia school teachers completely surprised me last week. I wouldn't expect the mostly female school teachers of West Virginia to shape their state government and get themselves a decent raise. It's not quite done. But anyway.
A historical comment and a question. It's interesting that the only organization in the United States that remembers the financing of the revolution are the sons and the daughters of the American Revolution, and they're very specific of what they call the donativo, which is the money that came from New Spain to finance the revolution, as they say, to finance the request of George Washington. Otherwise, it would have not happened. But given the importance, which I was completely unaware of the economy, and I'm so glad you were here to speak, President Grant, or former President Grant, and Matias Romero made the first effort in the 19th century to do a free trade agreement, and they were both blown out of the water by both legislatures. They were closer then than we're today. Why did that fail then?
I actually want to answer that in two parts. The donativo mattered a lot, but it's a wonderful Mexican historian named Guillermina de Valle Pabon. She's done a book recently. Mexico contributed so much more to Spain than that donativo. She has calculated that 20 million pesos, the donativo was about 500, 20 million pesos went to the support of the opposition to England in that war. Huge funding, even beyond what we knew. And by the way, the other place it's remembered and where I found it, because I'm not a son of, my Italian grandparents weren't here early enough to have fought that. You get any coin collector manual in the United States, they have to know. Because the value of coins start with the shift from the peso to the dollar. So they detail in the coin collector manual, yet you won't find it in the kids' textbooks ever that that's there. Okay, after the Matias, right, in the 1870s, you know, that was a tough moment. Both societies had devastating wars. U.S. Civil War, 60 to 65, 61 to 65. Mexico, right, the War of the Reform, about a year of breath, and then Maximilian, and we imagined a stable empire, but there was constant war when that's going on. So they are coming out of the devastating war. The irony is, again, the promoter of an open trade and free economy immediately was Benito Juarez. He was the pure liberal. He wanted to do that. But Diaz was a bit more, to him, a pragmatist. And he knew Mexico's had this amazing textile industry that had actually grown during the U.S.-Mexican War, during Maximilian, the Reform War and Maximilian. It is a large, booming textile industry. going to happen to it if he goes free trade at that moment. So you've got pragmatism, we will say. He knows that. And by the way, in the middle of all that, free trade, right? So the Mexican silver industry finally starts to grow in 1840. Finally in 1870, hits the same level of 1809, which was its prior peak. So it gets to its earlier peak in 1870. So for 60 years, you've been below the curve on its peak commodity. In 1870 and 1873, do you know what the industrialized world did? They all shifted to the gold standard. So the minute Mexico silver was rich enough to give it clout in the world economy, actually the British had gone to a de facto gold standard earlier. But the US and Germany were the two second players, 1870 and 1873. So Mexico should open its borders to free trade, just as its one industry is just emerging from war and needs to consolidate. And its one potential major contribution to the world economy, you guys are demonetizing. And by the way, if you really want the moment of the end of silver capitalism, in 1905, Mexico went to the gold standard. People don't remember the place that defined gold as global money. When silver goes to gold, it's like surrender. Our commodity is no longer what it was. So, I mean, again, I think it was pragmatics at that point. And, you know, I love the phrase free trade. I believe as a historian there is no such thing. Trade is structured by states in different ways, always. My ever so simple one, which may be being challenged these days, none of you want to trade in anything if your property rights and what you trade are not backed by some state, right? And none of you want to trade if the currency in which you engage in is not sanctioned by some state. And at that point I say, there's no such thing. Every trade has some state.
One exception.
That's what I'm saying. This may be changing. This may be the brave new world. And I just...
Not only is it not backed by states,
right.
It is actively being challenged.
Challenged by states, right. So I don't imagine what that's going to mean, right? But in all of that, then, it just makes... And every society that industrializes, and that includes Britain, the US, and Mexico when they did it, when you industrialize, you protect your industry to tariff barriers. The minute you have an industry strong enough to be dominant in the world, what do you propose? Free trade. And that is the endless cycle of history. And Mexico, yes, so the US in the 1870s says, oh, let's do free trade. He might have had some allies here. But Mexico is not in a position to do free trade. That would be my reading on that.
If I could just make it more of a comment, just thinking about what's going on right now and thinking about, nationalist capitalism and how it worked in Mexico and in the US. I mean, post-World War II, why is there this harkening back to the 1950s by, a gentleman like, Trump? Because he is,
you're so connected.
yeah. Because of course, Europe was decimated, Japan was decimated. The US was able to dominate and really set the rules of the game with very little discussion with anybody else, which was quite comfortable.
Well, and while facing the social experiment, but they sort of walled it off and built within. Yeah,
and also you had immigration within the US. You had massive migration of African Americans from the south to the north to the factories.
Yes.
And then at the same time too, in Mexico, you have a situation in which you kind of are ignored by the rest of the world too, and you can kind of do your own thing. So both societies too look back at that and say, oh, but that was actually pretty good, without taking into consideration, well, the circumstances have completely changed.
Exactly. And we imagine that we don't like changing circumstances because it's too complicated. Changing demographics, 20 million people instead of 100 million people, as if you can go back and forth, etc. But yeah, I guess just reflecting on this a little bit, I and a few others here can remember the 50s into the 60s, people with a straight face talked about the Mexican miracle. It was a model for the rest of the world. We forget. We know what happened later, and we now see the problem. But it was the Mexican miracle. And I remember straight-faced leading scholars in Europe, the US, and Mexico calling the PRI system as it existed in the 40s, 50s, and 60s as an experiment in limited corporatist democracy. It's not the generals, and it might be a model. All I'm going to say, I'm not defending any of that, but that was the perception of the moment.
Don't you think they never messed with Mexico and never said that Mexico is not a democracy because there weren't any communists, or there were few communists in Mexico?
No, I actually don't. I don't think so, no.
But why would they never
fact,
ever point out that Mexico wasn't a democracy?
Oh, they did point out.
Some
But
did point it out.
really,
I mean, they weren't a
they-
democracy the way we would do. I'm not saying it was the universal view, but in the broader set of things,
But
to
they were
me,
never
it was
concerned about it in
stable,
any
it
way.
accepted US capital, and I would say you put those
It
two
was
things
the
together,
stability, yeah.
and it sure didn't look as bad as Cuba from the United States.
Yeah.
And
No,
it
but
didn't
Amy, I
look like
can
the
assure you
generals.
that every American high official who came to visit me at different parts of
We're
my
worried
career
about communists.
kept saying, when are you going to be a democracy? Why aren't you a
Yeah.
democracy? And then basically I said, be careful what you wish for. And I think that's true. I think that's true.
Andres, I would have appreciated if you said, speak for yourself. When are you going to become a democracy?
Not all democracies are created equal. There are many different forms of democracy. As long as there's a vote.
But they were
there's
looking
something.
at democracy in their own image.
Yes.
They were looking at democracy in terms of not having one party as a monopoly government, elections that were not, suspect and so on.
Free and fair.
But yes, you're right.
I mean, I guess the US was never
Yeah.
concerned about regime change because it was in their interest to have a
Well,
stable,
stability in a way.
predictable Mexico.
Yeah, rule. But, and, what can I say? I was a kid growing up in the 50s in the United States. It wasn't, and I was then a product, so I was, I went through grade school, and I was white, but then I also lived the anti-war movements, the civil rights movements, the women's rights movements. Those were my college years. And boy, there was a recognition of our warts in the 60s. So it's really hard to look at the rest of the world when much of your population is saying you're fighting an unconscionable imperialist war on a poor country in Southeast Asia. You are not offering black people anything like equal rights. You're not offering women anything like equal rights. And which isn't to say high officials weren't still saying, follow us. But it's not a moment of self-reflective perfection at home.
Certainly not now.
And not now either. No. I want to thank you all for bringing me to Mexico for 2 days. To leave Trump to.
One question.
Just a quick reflection,
Yeah.
I think we can wrap up.
And I would like to hear your feedback. These silver cities have given identity to Mexico. Zacatecas, Guanajuato, San Luis Potosí, Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. And the greatness has been recognized by UNESCO as World Heritage. And they stopped exporting silver, and now they export migrants. And
They import silver.
well,
Tourists.
yes, tourists. Yes, that's my point. That now tourists and the migrants are the most interested on these kind of cities. They are the second and third generations of Mexicans are very interested on this. So they are a cyclical history from the
Yes.
historical point of view. They are looking to the identity of this.
And many studies have shown that the migrants to the United States are not the poorest of the poor, the most desperate. They're often people with a certain ambition, a certain drive, a limited education. They often are, so you're taking productive people and bringing them to a place where they perceive greater opportunity. That's one way to put it. But if I take the Bajío, I actually was at a conference in Aguascalientes a couple of years ago with Enrique Cardenas, a very different kind of historian and economic from me. But we were at this conference and we figured out there's a certain parallel, that if you take the vortex from Mexico City north in the interior, that was the booming region of silver capitalism, and it is now the booming region of modern Mexico. The Bajío doesn't make silver, It makes automobiles though for export.
And food.
Aguascalientes, it's assembling Bombardier airplanes. Well, one of the haciendas I studied for years now has the Bombardier assembly plant on it. Aguascalientes, that's where we were. The city that fed Zacatecas is now Nissan America del Norte. So that, the capitalist New Spain is capitalist Mexico in NAFTA. And then the coasts and the indigenous South did not have vibrant commercial economies in New Spain or the 19th century. They got some coffee and other exports for a time. And they are the place, sorry for the cynicism, what they have been left with is tourism and drugs. But it's the same regions. And this is sitting over lunches between this rattling gringo scholar and Enrique Cardenas, who says mainstream, we get along great.
He's not a political.
Yes.
So
Has
he's
Mexican
left that.
society changed anyway?
Yeah.
Has Mexican society changed?
So has Mexican society changed in any way since?
Yes and no. It has changed in enormous economic and other ways, but what drives me, and you will see the dedication of this book, the commitment of family within community to find a way forward. And it is there from living the crash in the depopulation in the 16th century. And you find it in the toughest urban barrio in the late 20th century. We got nothing, but we will work as best we can with the people we know and care about and make something. And let me share with you, I have a wonderful colleague, I don't know if you knew Denise Brennan. She's now doing a book on the indocumentados in the US. And she gave an early presentation at the seminar the other day. And what she documented was, in the communities of indocumentados, far more than anybody else, they are coming together in family and community. It's not just fighting for rights, they're building lives because they know nobody will help them and nobody can help them. So that's what I think is the constant, and that's what keeps me studying Mexico, is that commitment to find a way forward at the level of family community, which isn't to say there aren't some tough things going on in families and communities too. I have no idealization. Communities and families under stress get violent. One of the things this book does, in fact, is it has a series of studies of how socioeconomic stresses provoke violence. And less socioeconomic stress inhibits relief. It's not simple, it's not direct. So, but that's sort of my sense of continuity for Mexico and Mexico.
Isn't that curious, just as a colophon, the fact that in the 20th century, the two things that would basically attack in a good way the population explosion around the world were also born here, right? The Green Revolution and the pill.
Yes,
The
no.
anti-concept, the píldora anticonceptiva, the pill, the birth control pill, born right up here.
And but I've got to add, yes, the actual medical consolidation was in this neighborhood, but it first started with U.S. scientists spending years in the backcountry learning, some would say stealing, the skills of indigenous curanderas on how to control birth. And they learned those indigenous skills and they brought them to the laboratory and sort of synthesized.
The only part that was done here
In the city.
The synthesis. The rest was in the Barbasco parts of Mexico.
And in an interesting way, because the great sociologist Gary Gireffi did the work on the pharmaceutical industry doing this. And a wonderful Mexican-American woman named Gabriela Soto Laveaga has written a book called Jungle Laboratories on the whole process. And that was the book that made the career for a young Mexican-American woman to become a professor in the history of science at Harvard. All right. So she's very good. My pleasure. Thank you all
Thank you so much.
for being here for the conversation and for keeping me out of Washington, D.C.